What do corn, nitrogen, and soap have in common? Well, they all relate to Jason Spellmire's family farm. It's been in Ohio for about a century. Listen to all of that and more on today's episode of the Justice Podcast. Everybody wants to talk, but nobody wants to listen. So here's my petition. Instead of division, let's make our mission to change the system. Learn how the world works. Learn how we can act. Welcome, everybody, to the Justice Podcast. All right, Jason, thanks for joining us on the podcast today. I've already talked with you a little bit on a phone call prior to this, but I would love if you could share with the audience the story of your family farm.
Yeah, man, absolutely. So the farm, the original chunk of land is about 100 acres, and my grandfather bought it in 1936. So his family owned what had been a pretty successful hardware store in Cincinnati. And the story goes that his dad lent out way too much credit during the early years of the Depression. He thought, oh, this will be a passing thing, it'll be fine. And well, 4 or 5 years later, they were insolvent. So they lost the family business. And my grandfather, somehow, I think he had an aunt with some money who either lent him some money for the down payment or co-signed the loan. He bought this acreage up in what was then like the sticks. The family thought he was kind of crazy. That branch of the family hadn't farmed recently. So he moved up there. He had was just about to get married to my grandmother. And they moved up there in 41, I think. My grandpa was briefly in the Army, but then they discharged him when they found out he was a farmer. They needed farmers to make food for when the war kicked off. I think he got drafted in 40 or 41 and, maybe did basic training or something. So he had no experience farming. That branch of the family were mostly business people. The family ended up in Cincinnati like in the 1830s. That story is that the first relative to come over from Germany came down the Ohio River. He was headed to work in Indiana, which was like the frontier at the time in Southwest Indiana, in a sawmill, and he ran out of money for his boat passage somewhere around Cincinnati and got off the boat to make a little money to continue his voyage. Got a job driving a team of horses for this businessman. They got along well, and after a few months, the guy offered this would have been like great grandpa Jacob, or Jacob probably, offered him half the business. And he said no, he didn't think there was a future in the soap business. So Mr. Proctor went on to find Mr. Gamble later on. And
What? Oh,
I don't think that bodes well for the business acumen in the family. But the other story is that he had a chance to buy this piece of land in downtown Cincinnati for a hog and a barrel of whiskey or something crazy like this. And he turned it down because he said the real estate was no good there. And it now like the tallest skyscraper in Cincinnati is on that spot. Every time I make a dumb business decision, I say, well, I guess it runs in the family,
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. That's amazing. Okay, but continuing.
Yeah, right. So he starts farming in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s, pretty rough. 30s was like the Dust Bowl time period, which wasn't as bad in Ohio. Most of those pictures you see are like Oklahoma, where the whole prairie blew away, but it was still a bad drought year. So like they lost, when he bought the farm, there was a crop on it, which was supposed to make his first payment on the note, and it failed. So he's behind the 8 ball from the beginning, and he ended up, he worked a bunch of odd jobs. He drove the school bus. I think he drove a fuel truck, and then he farmed that, I think 60 tillable acres of the home farm, just scraping. They had 10 kids. My dad's one of 10. So, they're just he was doing whatever he could to get by. So that was, they had hogs, sheep. I think they had a milk cow. This was much more of like what you think of as an old time, family farm. They did grow corn and wheat, baled a little hay, but this was like, small time, pretty small time stuff, trying to feed the family. Um, and then he passed away pretty young. I think he was like 50 or 51. And my dad and one of his brothers, kind of when they were 19 or 20, decided to kind of go for it in the mid to late 70s and take take on a bunch of debt, buy equipment, start renting land to farm. And they were very, very aggressive. They worked their butts off. Sorry. And they just got after it. And then one of their brothers also kind of came back to help out halftime or so, as a mechanic. And yeah, so they went from farming. My grandpa farmed 60 acres probably, and then at their peak, my dad and his brother were farming like 3,500 acres. They did acquire a bit more land, but they never owned more than about 200 acres in the family in total. So most of that was farmed, rented, or what they call farmed on shares. So you split the input, split the profit. And then, so I got off active duty in 2015. My dad's brother, his business partner, had passed away while I was on active duty. And yeah, I came back and have been farming more or less since then. A couple of years I was kind of doing it half-time in the beginning. But yeah, so now my dad and I farm 1,500 or so acres, and my one uncle, my dad's brother, is kind of easing into retirement as our mechanic.
So what was that transition like from being an Army tank officer to being a farmer?
Yeah, man, it was not easy. It's a lot easier to leave than it is to come back, I think. That's kind of pretty well known, I guess. But so growing up on a farm served me very well in the Army. I mean, you kind of have this, I don't know, it's cliche, but like a can-do attitude. On a farm growing up, if something breaks, there's nobody you can call, right? You can't, I mean, I guess you could, but you got crops to harvest, it's about to rain. Maybe you could call a technician or a mechanic, but by the time they get there, like, you're hosed. So you just kind of got to figure it out, right? It's the old baling wire and duct tape kind of thing. So you figure out how to make things work, and that served me well in the Army. I mean, as an officer, I was often, my guys would laugh at me for like doing stuff that wasn't really my job. Like, you don't need to change the Humvee tire, sir. But like, it was weird for me to not do stuff that was fairly simple. And then so getting out, was interesting because it was going the other way. I was used to delegating and sort of having all of these resources to marshal. And everything is somebody's job, and there's a process. Coming back from that to farming, where it's like, all right, it's me and my dad, we got to get this done. Something breaks, it's not like I put it on order or write up a work order, go through the system. It's like, this is what we're doing, and we figure it out, and we don't go home till it's done, type of stuff. So in that sense, it was interesting to come back. It's also, in the military, you have a much bigger team and community, and I did miss that a lot on the farm. Working with my dad's great. There's also times you miss the camaraderie of a unit. I'm sure you know how that goes. So I would say it was not a super smooth transition, but my dad and I worked much better than like when I would come home on leave in the Army, or I briefly tried to work with him after college. And I think you take your licks, you grow up a little bit. I gained a lot of respect for my dad, and we're able to communicate and work together much better than when I was a kid, for sure. Where it was just like, he's telling me what to do, and I didn't have much sense of the bigger picture. Now we're kind of both in it together and invested, so it's a lot better.
Yeah, I'm sure as a partnership, there's just a mutual respect that doesn't exist in like a parent-child relationship in the same way.
Right. Exactly. And that didn't come overnight. It definitely took some work. But the point where we're at is a good one. And I used to, when I first came back, guys would tell me, people in my dad's generation, they'd say like, man, I wish I would give anything if my son worked with me. But, my son went off and is, making a bunch of money. He's a banker or something on Wall Street, and I'd always think like, I never really understood that, and they'd say like, your dad's really lucky to have you back. And I'd be like, I don't know, I didn't get it, but I guess I'm starting to get it. There's something that you can't replicate. Working alongside family is not always easy, but there's a reward there that is hard to find other places, I think. When we're out late at night trying to fix something, and kind of, you feel like you're up against the wall with time and weather, but you manage to pull off a field repair and get things done. It feels really good.
Yeah, no, I get that. The reward of a job well done can be beyond money, but I would like to talk about some of the economics, some of the actual cash components of farming. What is it like? Like, how many acres are you farming? How much are you pulling in? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we do about 1,500 acres right now, and like I said, only probably 120 of those are acres that we own, and the rest we do on two different systems depending on what the landowner wants to do. So you can either do it, and this is common. This is kind of how things are done in agriculture. It's either like a cash rent system, so we might pay $250 an acre and to rent this land, and anything else. So we rent it and we pay all the inputs, we get all the money. The other system is what they call farming on shares or sharecropping, in which case you split the inputs with the landowner and then split any profits as well. So on fluctuates every year. Right now, the inputs are through the roof. So these last couple of years have been tumultuous, I would say, because commodity prices have fluctuated dramatically, and so have in what we call input prices. So fuel and fertilizer being our big ones. So for example, diesel fuel, I don't know if you remember, in the spring was like, I think it was close to $6.50 a gallon. And so you figure some of our tractors have 250 gallon fuel tanks. So you're paying, well north of $1,000 to fill the tractor up. And that doesn't last very long during like the planting season, when you've got a 250 horsepower tractor, just pulling a 40-foot implement through the dirt. It takes a lot of fuel. So in a good year, like I said, you might get 60 bushels of beans to the acre, and that translates into, if it's land we own, you might maybe $400 to $500 profit per acre, would be pretty good. Now, if it's not land we own, then you're splitting that with the landowner. Corn can be more profitable, but there's also more risk associated with corn and more input cost associated with corn. You have to give it a lot more nitrogen. And this year, nitrogen has skyrocketed. Well, starting about a year ago, nitrogen, even before the Ukraine stuff kicked off, nitrogen was high. So nitrogen inputs almost tripled this year. So in a year like this, where we paid close to $6 a gallon for diesel, and our nitrogen costs were enormous, you're really counting on commodity prices staying high. So it's all about global weather and global and geopolitics, which is like a funny thing to say because our little patch of dirt, how much money we take home is like directly tied to what's going on in places of the world 9,000 miles away. So a lot of fertilizer comes from the Ukraine and Russia. They have like famously good fertilizer mines or production there. So when they cut the supply of there's a famous fertilizer called Russian red, which I think is phosphorus, and there's embargoes now. I think there's some exemptions, but something like that drives our costs up a ton. So that's a long way of saying for many farmers, you are hoping to just make enough money to service your debt, pay your bills, pay yourself a little bit. I mean, my dad didn't pay himself for like 20 years. They were living off what my mom made, the little bit of savings they had. And that said, we're in a much better position now because, I'm standing on the work that my dad and his brother did. And, we've got our debt paid down. But stuff is, like a combine. If we were to go buy a new combine right now, comparable to the one we have, about $500,000. And if you figure you're profiting, like I said, maybe $400 an acre on average, you think of how many acres you got to harvest to pay for that combine. It's quite a bit. So you're making decisions for like decades down the road. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, someone might think that technology and scientific developments over the years would make profit margins better or revenues higher. But it seems like that's not the case. What's the issue?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. The issue is partially we've just gotten too good. Technology has made us so much better at growing stuff that now, what an acre maybe 60 years ago might grow 70 bushels of corn, and now it's not unusual to get 240 bushels of corn out of that same acre. So we're so much more efficient at doing it that now we can make so much more product. You sort of like work yourself out of a job, and other parts of the world have started growing soybeans, namely like Brazil. Other countries in South America now grow vast swaths of soybeans. And so that goes back to the geopolitics thing, and global weather, for example. It's not unusual to listen to the farming channel on the radio, and they're talking about the weather in Brazil, which is interesting.
So how difficult would it be to switch crops from soybeans to something else if maybe something is going to generate more revenue?
Yeah, no, that's a question that a lot of farmers are asking, especially in our area. Difficult, but not impossible. So our system right now, is geared towards soybeans, corn, and wheat. So we've got, a harvester and the relevant attachments that harvest those things. We've got, a couple $1 million grain system for drying and storing grain. And depending on what crop you're switching to, that you could switch over to that. But it's kind of like when you invest a lot of money to streamline a system to be good at one thing, and then you kind of have to like crank the wheel, steer the ship in another direction. There's going to be a lot of associated input costs with changing crops. There is kind of, a lot of farmers are trying for specialty crops, or what we would call specialty is like anything that's not a major commodity that's traded on markets. There were people doing barley. The beer industry has got some people, the popularity of craft beer has got some people thinking about barley and hops. And I've played around with some of that stuff. But there's also like kind of a growing emphasis or awareness of where food comes from, and kind of more of an interest in agriculture. And that has led to some opportunities as far as people being more interested in buying stuff locally. And there's opportunities for shifting gears to fruits and vegetables, that kind of thing. And I do have a small kind of produce business on the side. And so a lot of farmers have done that, as it seemed kind of increasingly tough to compete on the global market without having a ton of land. So this is the story of agriculture in the past 50 years, is consolidation, right? So as the profit margins on an acre become slimmer, you have to own more land to make a living. And then so it's just led to the number of farmers decreasing and the land being farmed by an increasingly small number of companies. So there's companies, you don't have to go very far west of here, or there's people farming 20, 30, 40,000 acres of land, right? And that just kind of makes sense with the economics of it. So the alternative is to go small, right? And focus on value added or areas where you're not trying to compete globally. And that's kind of a thing that is becoming increasingly popular around here.
Given the amount of the business that is frankly just not even up to you, the geopolitics, government involvement, or just the market as a whole, what keeps you from just selling your land for housing development and taking the cash?
Yeah, it's a good one, man. I think from as young of an age as I can remember, the idea of selling the land would be like spitting on the Bible, I mean, I have heard my father. So land is so valuable where we are that it's fairly common to get unsolicited calls and letters from developers. My dad is usually a pretty calm guy, but I have never heard him use more strong language than when he is talking to someone who is trying to buy the land. What there's that show, Kevin Costner, Yellowstone. A couple years ago, I was watching that, and it just made me think of my dad so much. Like, this is like they might as well have made it a character study, at least the part about like protecting your land, not where he goes around killing people. My dad doesn't do that, but yeah. So I've heard him say "over my dead body" many times to people, and it's like a sacred thing. Like, you are sort of entrusted with this land, and to sell it would be just a violation of all that is sacred. I mean, and that's not to say that farmers don't sell their land, because obviously they do, and I don't think they're terrible people. Medical bills pile up, somebody gets old and needs to be in a nursing home, it's understandable. But yeah, it just doesn't enter my calculation. I mean, land around us routinely sells for $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 an acre. And so the number of years it would take to make that kind of money off of an acre is obviously enormous. So, which is why farmers cannot really afford to buy land around here where we are. We're just kind of in a corridor between two major highways. Cincinnati is, or at least remains to be seen if it still is booming. Even Dayton has had some life breathed into it. So Dayton's moving south, Cincinnati's moving north. Everybody wants to live out in the country who works in Dayton and Cincinnati. So, there's $1 million homes everywhere. but we're actually in the process of putting our farm in a preservation trust where it can't ever be developed. So it's protected in perpetuity. Even if we were to sell it, that stays with the deed, which dramatically lowers the value of the property, obviously, if it can't be developed. But yeah, I mean, the thought, like when I remember in the Army, I would literally have nightmares about like that I came home and there was like a subdivision on the farm or something. That's the kind of thing that you have nightmares about. Um, it's kind of hard to explain, but I would no sooner think of doing that as I would like, you know, beating my dog or something. I don't know. It's hard to fathom.
So, given the way that the world evolves, um, so if this trust, or I don't know all the legal stipulations of it, but let's say, 200 years from now, somebody still can't develop the land for anything other than farming. Um, like how would you know what it's even gonna look like that far in the future? And would you
Yeah.
still want it to be under control off of you signing this paper now?
Sorry, would I still want it to be? Oh, what you mean? Am I comfortable thinking it would never be developed?
Yeah, I mean, like, what if the situation changed
Yeah.
and there didn't need to be farming there? Um, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, if like we figure out a better way to make our food or something. Yeah, no, I would still want it to be I feel pretty strongly about like saving some land for wildlife too. Like not just because I like to hunt occasionally, hunt and fish, but you know, there that's a big problem around here too, is there's no open space for nature. And if it's not farming, I would want it to be wildlife habitat. Just let it grow up, you know. So I think I'm pretty okay with knowing that it's not gonna, at least it's not gonna be a strip mall, you know. I'd rather have, you know, deer and turkeys running around than you know, rich people throwing money at crap they don't need.
Okay. Um, Maybe the last question would be, when you're talking to people who don't work in the industry or aren't super familiar with farming, what do you feel like is the thing you have to explain
Mm.
the most often?
Yeah, I think probably like when I talk to people my age, because if you get a generation above us, most people aren't too far from the farm and they kind of get it. But people my age often think, you know, they say, "Oh, what do you farm or what do you raise?" And I'll say corn, soybeans, wheat mostly. And they'll kind of think, "Oh, so you're like a corporate farm or you're a factory farm." And well, no, I mean, of course it is, you know, it is an LLC. So it is a business, but there's this sort of mental gap for people who think there's, okay, you've got like a family farm, which is, you know, I don't know, 20 acres of organic free range carrots or something. And then you have like industrial farming, which is corn and soybeans. But there is still a pretty decent middle ground of people who are growing a considerable amount of food, um, but not, you know, we're not getting rich, you know, certainly not. We're just trying to pay our bills, keep the land for another generation, that sort of thing. So I find myself often like defending growing corn and soybeans to people who think that this is like some sort of a scam to like pump crappy food into the food system and get rich by doing it. Um, Certainly there are, I would say there's problems with how we do things right now. And that's for a variety of reasons. Some, you could argue that big agribusiness companies have sort of convinced the country to adopt these practices so that they can make a lot of money selling seed and chemicals. Um, it's not perfect, but I think one of the biggest things I try to impress on people is, look, you can you can think we should be farming organically, which is great. You can think that we shouldn't be growing as many corn and soybeans, but the sheer number of calories of, of protein, fats, and carbohydrates that we grow is kind of impressive. I don't mean, when I say we, I don't mean my family. I just mean like as a society, like we've figured out how to feed a lot of people on increasingly less and less farmland. And then, yeah, there's some problems with how we do it, but I mean, I kind of like to tell people like a cornfield is like a solar powered carbohydrate factory, right? Like you drive past a cornfield and you think like 100 years ago, the idea you could get 250 bushels of corn is just insane out of that spot, out of a patch of dirt. You know, those leaves are just soaking up sunlight, pulling carbon out of the air and the soil, and making carbohydrates. You know, and yeah, there's controversy about what we do with those. Ethanol. I'm not a chemist, but ethanol does kind of seem like a scam a lot of times. It takes more energy to put in than you get out. There's giant lobbying industries. So you get mixed up in all that stuff. And it's like, yeah, there's definitely they become kind of thorny issues and you can debate that. But like, it's pretty cool that we can have figured out how to like make these massive amounts of carbohydrates. And then with soybeans, it's massive amounts of protein and fat, same thing. So when you kind of step back and think of it on the scale of like achievements from back in the day, I don't know, 8,000 years ago when they first started, like they found a cool plant and we're like, oh, this is nice. So let's chuck some of these seeds in the ground and see what happens. To now, like, I don't know, it's kind of cool. Yeah, it probably messed up the environment. We're still figuring it out. It might not be how we always do it, but like there's some ingenuity there that you kind of got to admire. So I feel like I often find myself trying to at least get people who are kind of hostile to the idea because they've, I don't know, read some popular books that blame farming for global warming and lots of other problems. It can be a scapegoat. So I kind of find myself trying to reel that back in a little bit for people.
Well, Jason, thank you for the conversation today. This has been beneficial for me, and I'm sure all the listeners as well. I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely, man. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. This isn't financial, legal, or medical advice, but we do discuss how we might invest our resources for a healthier society. If you'd like to learn more about today's topic and other public policy issues, check out the website, thejusticepodcast.com.